Chapter 57. Esther's Narrative. I had gone to bed and fallen asleep when my guardian knocked at the door of my room and begged me to get up directly. On my hurrying to speak to him and learn what had happened, he told me, after a word or two of preparation, that there had been a discovery at Sir Leicester Dedlock's, that my mother had fled, that a person was now at our door who was empowered to convey her the fullest assurances of affectionate protection and forgiveness if he could possibly find her, and that I was sought for to accompany him in the hope that my entreaties might prevail upon her if his failed. Something to this general purpose I made out, but I was thrown in such a tumult of alarm and hurry and distress that, in spite of every effort I could make to subdue my agitation, I did not seem to myself fully to recover my right mind until hours had passed. But I dressed and wrapped up expeditiously without waking Charlie or anyone, and went down to Mr. Bucket, who was the person entrusted with the secret. In taking him to meet my guardian, he told me this, and also explained how it was that he had come to think of me. Mr. Bucket, in a low voice, by the light of my guardian's candle, read to me in the hall the letter that my mother had left upon her table, and I suppose within 10 minutes of my having been aroused, I was sitting beside him, rolling swiftly through the streets. His manner was very keen and yet considerate when he explained to me that a great deal might depend on my being able to answer without confusion a few questions that he wished to ask me. These were chiefly whether I had much communication with my mother, to whom he only referred as Lady Dedlock, and when and where I had spoken with her last, and how she had become possessed of my handkerchief. When I had satisfied him on these points, he asked me particularly to consider, taking time to think, whether within my knowledge there was any one, no matter where, in whom she might be at all likely to confide under circumstances of the last necessity. I could think of no one but my guardian, but by and by I mentioned Mr. Boythorn. He came into my mind as connected with his old chivalrous manner of mentioning my mother's name, and with what my guardian had informed me of his engagement to her sister, and his unconscious connection with her unhappy story. My companion had stopped the driver while we held this conversation, that we might the better hear each other. He now told him to go on again, and said to me, after considering within himself for a few moments, that he had made up his mind how to proceed. He was quite willing to tell me what his plan was, but I did not feel clear enough to understand it. We had not driven very far from our lodgings when we stopped in a by-street at a public-looking place lighted up with gas. Mr. Bucket took me in and sat me in an armchair by a bright fire. It was now past 1, as I saw by the clock against the wall. 2 police officers, looking in their perfectly neat uniform, not at all like people who were up all night, were quietly writing at a desk, and the place seemed very quiet altogether, except for some beating and calling out at distant doors underground, to which nobody paid any attention. The third man in uniform, whom Mr. Bucket called, and to whom he whispered his instructions, went out, and then the 2 others advised together, while one wrote from Mr. Bucket's subdued dictation. It was a description of my mother that they were busy with, for Mr. Bucket brought it to me when it was done, and read it in a whisper. It was very accurate indeed. The second officer, who had attended to it closely, then copied it out and called in another man in uniform. There were several in an outer room, who took it up and went away with it. All this was done with the greatest dispatch, and without a waste of a moment, yet nobody was at all hurried. As soon as the paper was sent out upon its travels, the 2 officers resumed their former quiet work of writing with neatness and care. Mr. Bucket thoughtfully came and warmed the soles of his boots, first one, then the other, at the fire. "Are you well wrapped up, Miss Summerson?" he asked me, as his eyes met mine. "It is a desperate sharp night for a young lady to be out in." I told him I cared for no weather and was warmly clothed. "It may be a long job," he observed. "So that it ends well. Never mind, miss. I pray to heaven it may end well," said I. He nodded comfortingly. "You see, whatever you do, don't go and fret yourself. Keep yourself cool and equal for anything that may happen, and it'll be the better for you, better for me, the better for Lady Dedlock, and the better for Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet." He was really very kind and gentle as he stood before the fire warming his boots and rubbing his face with his forefinger. I felt a confidence in his sagacity which reassured me. It was not yet 1:45 when I heard horses' feet and wheels outside. "Now, Miss Summerson," said he, "we are off, if you please." He gave me his arm, and the two officers courteously bowed me out, and we found at the door a phaeton or a barouche, with a postilion and post horses. Mr. Bucket handed me in and took up his own seat on the box. The man in uniform whom he had sent to fetch this equipage then handed him up a dark lantern at his request, and when he had given a few directions to the driver, we rattled away. I was far from sure that I was not in a dream. We rattled with great rapidity through such a labyrinth of streets that I soon lost all idea where we were, except that we had crossed and recrossed the river, and still seemed to be traversing low-lying waterside, dense neighbourhood of narrow thoroughfare, checkered by docks and basins, high piles of warehouses, swing bridges, and masts of ships. At length we stopped at the corner of a little slimy turning, which the wind from the river rushing up it did not purify, and I saw my companion, by the light of his lantern, in conference with several men who looked like a mixture of police and sailors. Against the mouldering wall by which they stood there was a bill on which I could discern the words "Found drowned," and this and an inscription about drags possessed me with the awful suspicion shadowed forth in our visit to that place. I had no need to remind myself that I was not there by the indulgence of any feeling of mine to increase the difficulties of the search, or to lessen its hopes, or enhance its delays. I remained quiet, but what I suffered in that dreadful spot I can never forget. And still it was like the horror of a dream. A man, yet dark and muddy, in long swollen sodden boots, and a hat like them, was called out of a boat and whispered with Mr. Bucket, who went away with him down some slippery steps, as if to look at something secret that he had to show. They came back, wiping their hands upon their coats, after turning over something wet. Thank God, it was not what I feared. After some further conference, Mr. Bucket, whom everybody seemed to know and defer to, went in with the others at a door and left me in the carriage, while the driver walked up and down by his horse to warm himself. The tide was coming in, as I judged from the sound it made, and I could hear it break at the end of the alley with a little rush towards me. It never did so, and I thought it did so hundreds of times, in what can have been at the most 1/4 of an hour, and probably was less, but the thought shuddered through me that it would cast my mother at the horse's feet. Mr. Bucket came out again, exhorting the others to be vigilant, darkened his lantern, and once more took his seat. "Don't you be alarmed, Miss Summerson, on account of our coming down here," he said, turning to me. "I only want to have everything in train, to know that it is in train, by looking after it myself. Get on, my lad." We appeared to retrace the way we had come. Not that I had taken note of any particular objects in my perturbed state of mind, but judging from the general character of the streets, we called at another office or station for a minute and crossed the river again. During the whole of this time, and during the whole search, my companion, wrapped up on the box, never relaxed in his vigilance on a single moment. But when we crossed the bridge he seemed, if possible, to be more on the alert than before. He stood up to look over the parapet. He alighted and went back after a shadowy female figure that flitted past us, and he gazed into the profound black pit of water with a face that made my heart die within me. The river had a fearful look, so overcast and secret, creeping away so fast between the low flat lines of shore, so heavy with indistinct and awful shapes, both of substance and shadow, so deathlike and mysterious. I have seen it many times since then, by sunlight and by moonlight, but never free from the impressions of that journey. In my memory the lights upon the bridge are always burning dim. The cutting wind is eddying round the homeless woman whom we pass. The monotonous wheels are whirling on, and the light of the carriage lamps reflected back looks palely in upon me, a face rising out of the dreaded water. Clattering and clattering through the empty streets, we came at length from the pavement onto a dark smooth road, and began to leave the houses behind us. After a while I recognised the familiar way to St. Albans. At Barnet fresh horses were ready for us, and we changed and went on. It was very cold indeed, and the open country was white with snow, though none was falling then. "An old acquaintance of yours, this road, Miss Summerson," said Mr. Bucket cheerfully. "Yes," I returned. "Have you gathered any intelligence?" "None that can be quite depended on as yet," he answered, "but it's early times as yet." He had gone into every late or early public house where there was a light. There were not a few at that time, and the road being then much frequented by drovers, and had got down to talk to the turnpike keepers. I heard him ordering drink and chinking money, and making himself agreeable and merry everywhere. But whenever he took his seat upon the box again, his face resumed its watchful, steady look, and he always said to the driver in the same business tone, "Get on, my lad." With all these stoppages, it was between 5 and 6 o'clock, and we were not yet a few miles short of St. Albans, when he came out of one of these houses and handed me a cup of tea. "Drink it, Miss Summerson. It'll do you good. You're beginning to get more yourself now, ain't you?" I thanked him, and said I hoped so. "You was what you may call stunned at first," he returned, "and Lord, no wonder. You don't speak loud, my dear. It's all right. She's on ahead." I don't know what joyful exclamation I made or was going to make, but he put up his finger, and I stopped myself. "Passed through here on foot this evening about 8 or 9. I heard of her first at the Archway toll over at Highgate. Couldn't make quite sure. I traced her all along, on and off, picked her up at one place and dropped her at another. But she's before us now, safe. Take hold of this cup and saucer, ostler. Now, if you wasn't brought up to the butter trade, look out and see if you can catch half a crown in t'other hand. 1, 2, 3, and there you are. Now, my lad, try a gallop." We were soon in St. Albans, and alighted a little before day, when I was just beginning to arrange and comprehend the occurrences of the night, and really to believe that they were not a dream. Leaving the carriage at the posting house, and ordering fresh horses to be ready, my companion gave me his arm, and we went towards home. "As this is your regular abode, Miss Summerson, you see," he observed, "I should like to know whether you have been asked for by any stranger answering the description, or whether Mr. Jarndyce has. I don't much expect it, but it might be." As we ascended the hill, he looked about him with a sharp eye. The day was now breaking, and reminded me that I had come down it one night, as I had reason for remembering, with my little servant and poor Joe, whom he called Tuffy. I wonder how he knew that. "When you passed the man upon the road just yonder, you know," said Mr. Bucket. "Yes, I remembered that too, very well. That was me," said Mr. Bucket. Seeing my surprise, he went on. "I drove down in a gig that afternoon to look after that boy. You might have heard my wheels when you came out to look after him yourself, for I was aware of you and your little maid going up when I was walking the horse down, making an inquiry or two about him in the town. I soon heard what company he was in, and was coming among the brick fields to look for him, when I observed you bringing him home here." "Had he committed any crime?" I asked. "None was charged against him," said Mr. Bucket, coolly lifting off his hat. "But I suppose he wasn't over particular. No, what I wanted him for was in connection with the keeping of this very matter of Lady Dedlock quiet. He had been making his tongue more free than welcome as to the small accidental service he had been paid for by the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn, and it wouldn't do, at any sort of price, to have him playing those games. So, having warned him out of London, I made an afternoon of it to warn him to keep out of it now he was away, and go further from it, and maintain a bright look out that I didn't catch him coming back again." "Poor creature," said I. "Poor enough," assented Mr. Bucket, "and trouble enough, and well enough away from London or anywhere else. I was regularly turned on my back when I found him taken up by your establishment, I do assure you." I asked him why. "Why, my dear?" said Mr. Bucket. "Naturally there was no end to his tongue then. He might as well have been born with a yard and a half of it, and a remnant over." Although I remember this conversation now, my head was in confusion at the time, and my power of attention hardly did more than enable me to understand that he entered into these particulars to divert me. With the same kind intention, manifestly, he often spoke to me of indifferent things, while his face was busy with the one object that we had in view. He still pursued this subject as we turned in at the garden gate. "Ah," said Mr. Bucket, "here we are, and a nice retired place it is. Puts a man in mind of the country house in the woodpecker tapping, that was known by the smoke which so gracefully curled. They're early with the kitchen fire, and that denotes good servants. But what you've always got to be careful of with servants is who comes to see 'em. You never know what they're up to if you don't know that. And another thing, my dear, whenever I find a young man behind the kitchen door, you give that young man in charge on suspicion of being secreted in a dwelling house with an unlawful purpose." We were now in the front of the house. He looked attentively and closely at the gravel for footprints before he raised his eyes to the windows. "Do you generally put that elderly young gentleman in the same room when he's on a visit here, Miss Summerson?" he inquired, glancing at Mr. Skimpole's usual chamber. "You know Mr. Skimpole?" said I. "What do you call him again?" returned Mr. Bucket, bending down his ear. "Skimpole, is it? I've often wondered what his name might be. Skimpole. Not John, I should say, or yet Jacob." "Harold," I told him. "Harold, yes. He's a queer bird, is Harold," said Mr. Bucket, eyeing me with great expression. "He's a singular character," said I. "No idea of money," observed Mr. Bucket. "He takes it, though." I involuntarily returned for answer that I perceived Mr. Bucket knew him. "Why, now I'll tell you, Miss Summerson," he replied. "Your mind will be all the better for not running on one point too continually. And I'll tell you for a change. It was him as pointed out to me where Tuffy was. I made up my mind that night to come to the door and ask for Tuffy, if that was all, but willing to try a move or so first, if any such was on the board. I just pitched up a morsel of gravel at that window where I saw a shadow. As soon as Harold opens it, and I have had a look at him, thinks I, you're the man for me. So I smoothed him down a bit about not wanting to disturb the family after they was gone to bed, and about its being a thing to be regretted that charitable young ladies should harbour vagrants. And then, when I pretty well understood his ways, said I should consider a £5 note well bestowed if I could relieve the premises of Tuffy without causing any noise or trouble. Then says he, lifting up his eyebrows in the gayest way, 'It's no use mentioning a £5 note to me, my friend, so I'm a mere child in such matters. I have no idea of money.' Of course I understood what his taking it so easy meant, and being now quite sure he was the man for me, I wrapped the note around a little stone and threw it up to him. Well, he laughs and beams, and looks as innocent as you like, and says, 'But I don't know the value of these things. What am I to do with this?' 'Spend it, sir,' says I. 'But I shall be taken in,' he says. 'They won't give me the right change. I shall lose it. It's no use to me.' Lord, you never saw such a face as he carried with it. Of course he told me where to find Tuffy, and I found him." I regarded this as very treacherous on the part of Mr. Skimpole towards my guardian, and as passing the usual bounds of his childish innocence. "Bounds, my dear," returned Mr. Bucket. "Bounds now, Miss Summerson. I'll give you a piece of advice that your husband will find useful when you're happily married and got a family about you. Wherever a person says to you that they are as innocent as can be in all concerning money, look well after your own money, for they are dead certain to collar it if they can. Whenever a person proclaims to you, in worldly matters I'm a child, you consider that a person is only a crying off from being held accountable, and that you have got that person's number, and it's number 1. Now, I'm not a poetical man myself, except in a vocal way when it goes round a company, but I'm a practical one, and that's my experience. So's this rule, fast and loose in one thing, fast and loose in everything. I never knew it fail. No more will you, nor no one. With which caution to the unwary, my dear, I take the liberty of pulling this here bell, and so go back to our business." I believe it had not been for a moment out of his mind, any more than it had been out of my mind or out of his face. The whole household were amazed to see me without any notice at that time in the morning, and so accompanied, and their surprise was not diminished by my inquiries. No one, however, had been there. It could not be doubted that this was the truth. "Then, Miss Summerson," said my companion, "we can't be too soon at the cottage where those brickmakers are to be found. Most inquiries there I leave to you, if you'll be so good as to make 'em. The naturalist's way is the best way, and the naturalist's way is your own way. We set off again immediately. On arriving at the cottage we found it shut up, and apparently deserted. By one of the neighbours who knew me, and who came out when I was trying to make someone hear, informed me that the two women and their husbands now lived together in another house, made of loose rough bricks, which stood on the margin of the piece of ground where the kilns were, and where the long rows of bricks were drying. We lost no time in repairing to this place, which was within a few hundred yards, and as the door stood ajar, I pushed it open. There were only three of them sitting at breakfast, a child lying asleep on a bed in the corner. It was Jenny, the mother of the dead child, who was absent. The other woman rose on seeing me, and the men, though they were as usual sulky and silent, each gave me a morose nod of recognition. A look passed between them, and when Mr. Bucket followed me in, I was surprised to see that the woman evidently knew him. I had asked leave to enter, of course. Liz, the only name by which I knew her, rose to give me her own chair, but I sat down on a stool near the fire, and Mr. Bucket took a corner of the bedstead. Now that I had to speak and was among people with whom I was not familiar, I became conscious of being hurried and giddy. It was very difficult to begin. I could not help bursting into tears. "Liz," said I, "I've come a long way in the night and through the snow to inquire after a lady." "Who has been here, you know," Mr. Bucket struck in, addressing the whole group with a composed proprietary face. "That's the lady the young lady means. The lady was here last night, you know." "And who told you there was anybody here?" inquired Jenny's husband, who had made a surly stop in his eating to listen, and now measured him with his eye. "A person of the name of Michael Jackson, with a blue velveteen waistcoat and a double row of mother of pearl buttons," Mr. Bucket immediately answered. "He had as good as mind his own business, whoever he is," growled the man. "He's out of employment, I believe," said Mr. Bucket apologetically for Michael Jackson, "and so gets talking." The woman had not resumed her chair, but stood faltering with her hand upon its broken back, looking at me. I thought she would have spoken to me privately if she dared. She was still in this attitude of uncertainty when her husband, who was eating with a lump of bread and fat in one hand and his clasp knife in the other, struck the handle of his knife violently on the table, and told her with an oath to mind her own business, at any rate, and sit down. "I should like to have seen Jenny very much," said I, "for I am sure she would have told me all she could about this lady, who I am very anxious indeed, you cannot think how anxious, to overtake. Will Jenny be here soon? Where is she?" The woman had a great desire to answer, but the man, with another oath, openly kicked at her foot with his heavy boot. He left it to Jenny's husband to say what he chose, and after a dogged silence the latter turned his shaggy head towards me. "I'm not partial to gentlefolks coming into my place, as you've heard me say afore now, I think, miss. I let their places be. It's a curious they can't let my place be. There'd be a pretty shine made if I was to go with visiting them. I think, howsoever, I don't so much complain of you as of some others, and I'm agreeable to make you a civil answer, though I give notice I'm not going to be drawed like a badger. Will Jenny be here soon? No, she won't. Where is she? She's gone up to London." "Did she go last night?" I asked. "Did she go last night? Ah, she went last night," he answered with a sulky jerk of his head. "But was she here when the lady came? And what did the lady say to her? And where is the lady gone? I beg and pray you to be so kind as to tell me," said I, "for I am in great distress to know." "If my master would let me speak and not say a word of harm," the woman timidly began. "Your master," said her husband, muttering an imprecation with a slow emphasis, "will break your neck if you meddle with what don't concern you." Another silence. The husband of the absent woman, turning to me again, answered with his usual grumbling unwillingness. "Was Jenny here when the lady come?" "Yes, she was, when the lady come." "What did the lady say to her?" "Well, I'll tell you what the lady said to her. She said, 'You remember me as come one time to talk to you about a young lady as had been a visiting of you? You remember me as to give you something handsome for the handkerchief what she had left?' And she remembered, so we all did. Well then, was that young lady up at the house now?" "No, she weren't up at the house now." "Well then, look'ee here. The lady was upon a journey all alone, strange as we might think it, and she could rest herself where you were sitting an hour ago. Yes, she could, and so she did. Then she went. It might be at 20 minutes past 11. It might be at 20 minutes past 12. I ain't got no watches here, you know, the time by. Nor yet clocks. Where did she go? I don't know where she goes. She went one way and Jenny went the other. One went right to London, the other went right from it. That's all about it. Ask this man. He heard it all, and he see it all. He knows. The other man repeated, that's all about it. Was the lady crying? I inquired. Devil a bit, returned the first man. Her shoes was the worst, and her clothes was the worst, but she warn't, not as I see. The woman sat with her arms crossed and her eyes upon the ground. Her husband had turned a little in his seat so as to face her, and kept his hammer-like hand upon the table, as if it were in readiness to execute his threat if she disobeyed him. I hope you will not object to my asking your wife, said I, how the lady looked. Come, then, he gruffly cried to her. You hear what she says. Cut it short and tell her. Bad, replied the woman. Pale and exhausted. Very bad. Did she speak much? Not much. Her voice was hoarse. She answered, looking all the while at her husband for leave. Was she faint, said I. Did she eat or drink here? Go on, said the husband, in answer to a look. Tell her and cut it short. She had little water, miss, and Jenny fetched her some bread and tea, but she hardly touched it. And when she went from here, I was proceeding when Jenny's husband patiently took me up. When she went from here, she went right away, nor by the high road. Ask on the road if you doubt me, and see if it weren't so. And there's an end. That's all about it. I glanced at my companion, finding that he had already risen, was ready to depart. Thanked them for what they had told me, and took my leave. The woman looked full at Mr. Bucket as he went out, and he looked full at her. Now, Miss Summerson, he said, as we walked quickly away, they've got her ladyship's watch among them. That's a positive fact. You saw it? I exclaimed. Just as good as saw it, he returned. Else why should he talk about his 20 minutes past, and about his having no watch to tell the time by? 20 minutes? He don't usually cut his time so fine as that. If it comes to half hours, it's as much as he does. Now, you see, either her ladyship gave him that watch, or he took it. I think she gave it to him. Now, what should she give it to him for? What should she give it to him for? He repeated this question to himself several times as we hurried on, appearing to balance between a variety of answers that arose in his mind. If time could be spared, said Mr. Bucket, which is the only thing that can't be spared in this case, I might get it out of that woman, but it's too doubtful a chance to trust you under present circumstances. They are up to keeping a close eye upon her, and any fool knows that a poor creature like her, beaten and kicked and scarred and bruised from head to foot, will stand by the husband that ill uses her through thick and thin. There's something kept back. It's a pity but what we had seen the other woman. I regretted it exceedingly, for she was very grateful, and I felt sure would have resisted no entreaty of mine. It's possible, Miss Summerson, said Mr. Bucket, pondering on it, that her ladyship sent her up to London with some word for you, and it's possible that her husband got the watch to let her go. It don't come out altogether so plain as to please me, but it's on the cards. Now, I don't take kindly to laying out the money of Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, on these roughs, and I don't see my way to the usefulness of it at present. No, so far our road, Miss Summerson, is forward, straight ahead. Keep everything quiet. We called at home once more, that I might send a hasty note to my guardian. Then we hurried back to where we had left the carriage. The horses were brought out as soon as we were seen coming, and we were on the road again in a few minutes. It had set in snowing at daybreak, and now it snowed hard. The air was so thick with the darkness of the day and the density of the fall that we could see a very little way in any direction. Although it was extremely cold, the snow was but partially frozen, and it churned with a sound as if it were a beach of small shells under the hoofs of the horses into mire and water. They sometimes slipped and floundered for a mile together, and we were obliged to come to a standstill to rest them. One horse fell 3 times in this first stage, and trembled so and was so shaken that the driver had to dismount him from his saddle and lead him at last. I could eat nothing, and I could not sleep. I grew so nervous under those delays and the slow pace at which we travelled that I had an unreasonable desire upon me to get out and walk. Yielding to my companion's better sense, however, I remained where I was, all this time kept fresh by a certain enjoyment of the work in which he was engaged. He was up and down at every house we came to, addressing people whom he had never beheld before as old acquaintances, running in to warm himself at every fire he saw, talking and drinking and shaking hands at every bar and tap, friendly with every waggoner, wheelwright, blacksmith, and toll-taker, yet never seeming to lose the time, and always mounting to the box again with his watchful, steady face and his business-like "Get on, my lad." When we were changing horses the next time, he came from the stable-yard with the wet snow encrusted upon him and dropping off him, plashing and crashing through it to his wet knees, as he had been doing frequently since we left St. Albans, and spoke to me at the carriage side. "Keep up your spirits. It's certainly true that she came on here, Miss Summerson. There is not a doubt of the dress by this time, and the dress has been seen here." "Still on foot?" said I. "Still on foot. I think the gentleman you mentioned must be the point she's aiming at, and yet I don't like his living down in her own part of the country neither." "I know so little," said I. "There may be someone else nearer here of whom I've never heard." "That's true, but whatever you do, don't you fall a crying, my dear, and don't you worry yourself no more than you can help. Get on, my lad." The sleet fell all that day unceasingly. The thick mist came on early, and it never rose or lightened for a moment. Such roads I had never seen. Sometimes I feared we had missed the way and got into the ploughed grounds or the marshes. If ever I thought of the time I had been out, it presented itself as an indefinite period of great duration, and I seemed, in a strange way, never to have been free from the anxiety under which I then laboured. As we advanced, I began to feel misgivings that my companion lost confidence. He was the same as before with all the roadside people, but he looked graver when he sat by himself on the box. I saw his finger uneasily going across and across his mouth during the whole of one long weary stage. I overheard that he began to ask drivers of coaches and other vehicles coming towards us what passengers they had seen in other coaches and vehicles that were in advance. Their replies did not encourage him. He always gave me a reassuring beck of his finger and a lift of his eyelid as he got up on the box again, but he seemed perplexed now when he said, "Get on, my lad." At last, when we were changing, he told me that he had lost the track of the dress so long that he began to be surprised. It was nothing, he said, to lose such a track for one while, and to take it up for another while, and so on, but it had disappeared here in an unaccountable manner, and we had not come upon it since. This corroborated the apprehensions I had formed, when he began to look at the direction posts, and to leave the carriage at crossroads for a quarter of an hour at a time while he explored them. But I was not to be downhearted, he told me, for it was as likely as not that the next stage might set us right again. The next stage, however, ended as that one ended. We had no new clue. There was a spacious inn here, solitary, but a comfortable, substantial building, and as we drove in under a large gateway, before I knew it, where a landlady and her pretty daughters came to the carriage door, entreating me to alight and refresh myself while the horses were making ready. I thought it would be uncharitable to refuse. They took me upstairs to a warm room and left me there. It was at the corner of the house, I remember, looking two ways. One side to a stable yard, open to a by road, where the ostlers were unharnessing the splashed and tired horses from the muddy carriage, and beyond that to the by road itself, across which the sign was heavily swinging, and on the other side to a wood of dark pine trees. Their branches were encumbered with snow, and it silently dropped off in wet heaps while I stood at the window. Night was setting in, and its bleakness was enhanced by the contrast of the pictured fire glowing and gleaming in the window pane. As I looked among the stems of the trees and followed the discoloured marks in the snow where the thaw was sinking into it and undermining it, I thought of the motherly face brightly set off by daughters that had just now welcomed me, and of my mother lying in such a wood to die. I was frightened when I found them all about me, but I remembered that before I fainted I had tried very hard not to do it. That was some little comfort. They cushioned me up on a large sofa by the fire. Then the comely landlady told me that I must travel no further to-night, but must go to bed. But this put me in such a tremble lest they should detain me there, that she soon recalled her words and compromised for a rest of half an hour. A good, endearing creature she was, she and her three fair girls, all so busy about me, I was to take hot soup and broiled fowl, while Mr. Bucket dried himself and dined elsewhere. But I could not do it, when a snug round table was presently spread by the fireside, though I was very unwilling to disappoint them. However, I could take some toast and some hot negus, and as I really enjoyed that refreshment, it made some recompense. Punctual to the time, at the half-hour's end, the carriage came rumbling under the gateway, and they took me down, warmed and refreshed, comforted by kindness, and safe, I assured them, not faint any more. After I had got in and had taken a grateful leave of them all, the youngest daughter, a blooming girl of 19, who was to be the first married, they had told me, got upon the carriage step, reached in and kissed me. I have never seen her from that hour, but I think of her to this hour as my friend. The transparent windows, with the fire and light looking so bright and warm from the cold darkness out of doors, were soon gone, and again we were crushing and churning the loose snow. We went on with toil enough, but the dismal roads were not much worse than they had been, and the stage was only 9 miles. My companion, smoking on the box, I had thought at the last of begging him to do so, when I saw him standing at a great fire in a comfortable cloud of tobacco, was as vigilant as ever, and as quickly down and up again when we came to any human abode or any human creature. He had lighted his little dark lantern, which seemed to be a favourite with him, for we had lamps to the carriage, and every now and then he turned it upon me to see that I was doing well. There was a folding window to the carriage head, but I never closed it, for it seemed like shutting out hope. We came to the end of the stage, and still the lost trace was not recovered. I looked at him anxiously when we stopped to change, but I knew by his yet graver face as he stood watching the ostlers that he had heard nothing. Almost an instant afterwards, as I leaned back in my seat, he looked in with his lighted lantern in his hand, an excited and quite different man. "What is it?" said I, starting. "Is she here?" "No, no, don't deceive yourself, my dear. Nobody's here, but I've got it." The crystallized snow was in his eyelashes, in his hair, lying in ridges on his dress. He had to shake it from his face and get his breath before he spoke to me. "Now, Miss Summerson," said he, beating his finger on the apron, "don't you be disappointed at what I'm going to do. You know me. I'm Inspector Bucket. You can trust me. We've come a long way. Never mind. 4 horses out there for the next stage. Up, quick." There was a commotion in the yard, and a man came running out of the stables to know if he meant up or down. "Up, I tell you. Up. Ain't it English? Up." "Up," said I, astonished. "To London? Are we going back?" "Miss Summerson," he answered, "back, straight as a die. You know me. Don't be afraid. I'll follow the other, by God." "The other? Who? You called her Jenny, didn't you? I'll follow her. Bring those 2 pair out here for a crown a man. Wake up, some of you. You will not desert this lady we are in search of. You will not abandon her on such a night in such a state of mind as I know her to be in," said I, in agony, grasping his hand. "You're right, my dear, I won't, but I'll follow the other. Look alive here with them horses. Send a man forward in the saddle to the next stage, and let him send another forward again, and order 4 on, up right through. My darling, don't you be afraid." The orders, and the way in which he ran about the yard urging them, caused a general excitement that was scarcely less bewildering to me than the sudden change. But in the height of the confusion a mounted man galloped away to order the relays, and our horses were put to with great speed. "My dear," said Mr. Bucket, jumping to his seat and looking in again, "you'll excuse me if I'm too familiar. Don't you fret and worry yourself no more than you can help. I say nothing at present, but you know me, my dear. Now don't you?" I endeavoured to say that I knew he was far more capable than I of deciding what we ought to do. But was he sure that this was right? Could I not go forward by myself in search of— I grasped his hand again in my distress, and whispered it to him— of my own mother? "My dear," he answered, I know. And would I put you wrong? Do you think, Inspector Bucket? Now you know me, don't you?" What could I say but yes? "Then you keep up as good a heart as you can, and you rely upon me for standing by you no less than by Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet. Now are you right there?" "All right, sir. Off she goes then, and get on, my lads." We were again upon the melancholy road by which we had come, tearing up the miry sleet and thawing snow as if they were torn up by a water wheel. Chapter 58. A wintry day and night. Still impassive, as behoves its breeding, the Dedlock town house carries itself as usual towards the street of dismal grandeur. There are powdered heads from time to time in the little windows of the hall, looking out at the untaxed powder falling all day from the sky, and in the same conservatory there is a peach blossom, turning itself exotically to the great hall fire from the nipping weather of outdoors. It is given out that my lady has gone down into Lincolnshire, but is expected to return presently. Rumour, busy overmuch, however, will not go down into Lincolnshire. It persists in flitting and chattering about town. It knows that poor unfortunate man Sir Leicester has been sadly used. It hears, my dear child, all sorts of shocking things. It makes a world of 5 miles round quite merry. Not to know that there is something wrong at the Dedlocks is to augur yourself unknown. One of the peachy-cheeked charmers with the skeleton throats is already apprised of the principal circumstances that will come out before the Lords on Sir Leicester's application for a bill of divorce. At Blaze and Sparkle's the jewellers, and at Sheen and Gloss the mercers, it is and will be for several hours the topic of the age, the feature of the century. The patronesses of these establishments, albeit so loftily inscrutable, being as nicely weighed and measured there is as any other article of stock in the trade, are perfectly understood in this new fashion by the rawest hand behind the counter. "Our people, Mr. Jones," said Blaze and Sparkle to the hand in question on engaging him. "Our people, sir, are sheep, mere sheep. Where 2 or 3 marked ones go, all the rest follow. Keep these 2 or 3 in your eye, Mr. Jones, and you'll have the flock." So likewise Sheen and Gloss to their Jones, in reference to knowing where to have the fashionable people, and how to bring what they, Sheen and Gloss, choose into fashion. On similar unerring principles Mr. Sladdery, the librarian, and indeed the great farmer of gorgeous sheep, admits this very day. "Why, yes, sir, there certainly are reports concerning Lady Dedlock, very current indeed among my high connection, sir. You see, my high connection must talk about something, sir, and it's only to get a subject of vogue with 1 or 2 ladies I could name to make it go down with the whole. Just what I should have done with those ladies, sir, in the case of any novelty you had left to me to bring in. They have done themselves in this case through knowing Lady Dedlock, and being perhaps a little innocently jealous of her too, sir. You'll find, sir, that this topic will be very popular among my high connection. If it had been a speculation, sir, it would have brought money. And when I say so, you may trust to my being right, sir, for I've made it my business to study my high connection, and to be able to wind it up like a clock, sir. Thus rumour thrives in the capital, and will not go down into Lincolnshire. By 5:30 post-meridian Horse Guards time, it has even elicited a new remark from the Honourable Mr. Stables, which bids fair to outshine the old one, on which he has so long rested his colloquial reputation. This sparkling sally is to the effect that though he always knew she was the best groomed woman in the stud, he had no idea she was a bolter. This is immensely received in turf circles. At feasts and festivals also, in firmaments she is often graced, and among constellations she outshone but yesterday. She is still the prevalent subject. What is it? Who is it? When was it? Where was it? How was it? She is discussed by her dear friends with all the genteelest slang in vogue, with the last new word, the last new manner, the last new drawl, and the perfection of polite indifference. A remarkable feature of the theme is that it is found to be so inspiring that several people come out upon it who never came out before, positively say things. William Buffy carries one of these smartnesses from the place where he dines down to the house, where the whip for his party hands it about with his snuff-box to keep men together who want to be off. With such effect the speaker, who has had it privately insinuated into his own ear under the corner of his wig, cries, "Order at the bar," 3 times without making an impression. And not the least amazing circumstance connected with her having been vaguely the town talk is that people hovering on the confines of Mr. Sladdery's high connection People who know nothing, and ever did know nothing about her, think it essential to their reputation, pretend that she is their topic too, and retail her at second hand with the last new word, and the last new manner, and the last new drawl, and the last new polite indifference, and all the rest of it, all second hand, but considered equal to new and inferior systems and to fainter stars. If there be any man of letters, art, or science among these little dealers, how noble in him to support the feeble sisters on such majestic crutches. So goes the wintry day outside the Dedlock mansion. How within it? Sir Leicester is lying in his bed, can speak a little, though with difficulty and indistinctness. He is enjoined to silence and to rest, and they have given him some opiate to lull his pain, for his old enemy is very hard with him. He is never asleep, although sometimes he seems to fall into a dull waking doze. He caused his bedstead to be moved out nearer to the window when he heard it was such inclement weather, and his head to be so adjusted that he could see the driving snow and sleet. He watches as it falls throughout the whole wintry day. Upon the least noise in the house, which is kept hushed, his hand is at the pencil. The old housekeeper, sitting by him, knows what he would write, and whispers, "No, he has not come back yet, Sir Leicester. It was late last night when he went. He has been but a little time gone yet." He withdraws his hand and falls to looking at the sleet and snow again, until they seem, by being long looked at, to fall so thick and fast that he is obliged to close his eyes for a minute on the giddy whirl of white flakes and icy blots. He began to look at them as soon as it was light. The day is not yet far spent when he conceives it to be necessary that a room should be prepared for her. It is very cold and wet. Let there be good fires. Let them know that she is expected. Please see to it yourself. He writes to this purpose on his slate, and Mrs. Rouncewell, with a heavy heart, obeys. "For I dread, George," the old lady says to her son, who waits below to keep her company when she has a little leisure, "I dread, my dear, that my lady will never more set foot within these walls." "That's a bad presentiment, mother." "Nor yet within the walls of Chesney Wold, my dear." "That's worse. But why, mother?" "When I saw my lady yesterday, George, she looked at me. She looked to me, and I may say at me too, as if the step on the Ghost's Walk had almost walked her down." "Come, come, you alarm yourself with old story fears, mother." "No, I don't, my dear. No, I don't. It's going on for 60 years that I've been in this family. I never had any fears for it before. But it's breaking up, my dear. The great old Dedlock family is breaking up." "I hope not, mother." "I am thankful that I have lived long enough to be with Sir Leicester in this illness and trouble, for I know I am not too old nor too useless to be a welcomer sight to him than anybody else in my place would be. But the step on the Ghost's Walk will walk my lady down, George. It has been many a day behind her, and now it will pass her and go on." "Well, mother dear, I say again, I hope not." "And so do I, George," the old lady returned, shaking her head and parting her folded hands. "But if my fears come true, and he has to know it, who will tell him?" "Are these her rooms?" "They are my lady's rooms, just as she left them." "Why, now," says the trooper, glancing round him and speaking in a lower voice, "I begin to understand how you come to think as you do think, mother. Rooms get an awful look about them when they are fitted up like these. For one person you are used to seeing them, and that person is away, under any shadow, let alone being God knows where. He is not far out, as all partings foreshadow the great final one. So empty rooms, bereft of familiar presence, mournfully whisper what your room and what mine must one day be. My lady's state has a hollow look, thus gloomy and abandoned, and in the inner apartment where Mr. Bucket last night made his secret perquisition, the traces of her dresses and ornaments, even the mirrors accustomed to reflect them when they were a portion of herself, have a desolate and vacant air. Dark and cold as the wintry day is, it is darker and colder in these deserted chambers than in many a hut that will barely exclude the weather. And though the servants heap fires in the grates, and set the couches and chairs within the warm glass screens that let their ruddy light shoot through to the furthest corners, There is a heavy cloud upon the rooms, which no light will dispel. The old housekeeper and her son remain until the preparations are complete, and then she returns upstairs. Volumnia has taken Mrs. Rouncewell's place in the meantime. Though pearl necklaces and rouge pots, however calculated to embellish Bath, are but indifferent comforts to the invalid under present circumstances, Volumnia, not being supposed to know, and indeed not knowing, what is the matter, has found it a ticklish task to offer appropriate observations, and consequently has supplied their place with distracting smoothings of the bed linen, elaborate locomotion on tiptoe, vigilant peeping at her kinsman's eyes, and one exasperating whisper to herself of "he is asleep," in disproof of which superfluous remark Celeste has indignantly written on the slate, "I am not." Yielding therefore the chair at the bedside to the quaint old housekeeper, Volumnia sits at a table a little removed, sympathetically sighing. Celeste watches the sleet and snow, and listens for the returning steps that he expects. In the ears of his old servant, looking as if she had stepped out of an old picture frame to attend a summoned deadlock to another world, the silence is fraught with echoes of her own words. Who will tell him? He has been under his valet's hands this morning to be made presentable, and is as well got up as the circumstances will allow. He is propped with pillows, his grey hair is brushed in its usual manner, his linen is arranged to a nicety, and he is wrapped in a responsible dressing gown. His eyeglass and his watch are ready to his hand. It is necessary, less to his own dignity, and now perhaps for her sake, that he should be seen as little disturbed and as much himself as may be. Women will talk, and Volumnia, though a deadlock, is no exceptional case. He keeps her here, there is little doubt, to prevent her talking somewhere else. He is very ill, but he makes his presence stand against the distress of mind and body most courageously. The fair Volumnia, being one of those sprightly girls who cannot long continue silent without imminent peril of seizure by the dragon boredom, soon indicates the approach of that monster with a series of undisguisable yawns. Finding it impossible to suppress those yawns by any other process than conversation, she compliments Mrs. Rouncewell on her son, declaring that he positively is one of the finest figures she ever saw, and as a soldierly-looking person she should think what's his name, her favourite life guardsman, the man she dotes on, the dearest of creatures, who was killed at Waterloo. Celeste hears this tribute with so much surprise, and stares about him in such a confused way, that Mrs. Rouncewell feels it necessary to explain. "Miss Dedlock, don't speak of my eldest son, Celeste, but my youngest. I have found him. He has come home." Celeste breaks the silence with a harsh cry. "George, your son George, come home, Mrs. Rouncewell?" The old housekeeper wipes her eyes. "Thank God, yes, Celeste." Does this discovery of someone lost, this return of someone so long gone, come upon him as a strong confirmation of his hopes? Does he think, shall I not, with the aid I have, recall her safely after this, there being fewer hours in her case than there are years in his life? It is of no use entreating him. He is determined to speak now, and he does, in thick crowd of sounds, but intelligibly enough to be understood. "Why did you not tell me, Mrs. Rouncewell?" "Happened only yesterday, Celeste, and I doubted your being well enough to be talked of such things." Beside the giddy Volumnia now remembers with a little scream that nobody was to have known of his being Mrs. Rouncewell's son, and that she was not to have told. But Mrs. Rouncewell protests, with warmth enough to swell the stomacher, that of course she would have told Celeste as soon as he got better. "Where is your son George, Mrs. Rouncewell?" asks Celeste. Mrs. Rouncewell, not a little alarmed by his disregard of the doctor's injunction, replies, "In London." "Where in London?" Mrs. Rouncewell is constrained to admit that he is in the house. "Bring him here to my room. Bring him directly." The old lady can do nothing but go in search of him. Celeste, with such power of movement as he has, arranges himself a little to receive him. When he has done so, he looks out again at the falling sleet and snow, and listens again for the returning steps. A quantity of straw has been tumbled down in the street to deaden noises there, and she might be driven to the door perhaps without his hearing wheels. He is lying thus, apparently forgetful of his newer and minor surprise, when the housekeeper returns, accompanied by her trooper son. Mr. George approaches softly to the bedside, making his bow, squares his chest, and stands with his face flushed, very heartily ashamed of himself. "Good heaven! And it is really George Rouncewell!" exclaims Sir Leicester. "Do you remember me, George?" The trooper needs to look at him to separate the sound from that sounder before he knows what he has said. But doing this, and being a little helped by his mother, he replies, "I must have a very bad memory indeed, Sir Leicester, if I fail to remember you." "When I look at you, George Rouncewell," Sir Leicester observes with difficulty, "I see something of a boy at Chesney Wold. I remember well, very well." He looks at the trooper until tears come into his eyes. Then he looks at the sleet and snow again. "I ask your pardon, Sir Leicester," says the trooper, "but would you accept of my arms to raise you up? You would lie easier, Sir Leicester, if you would allow me to move you." "If you please, George Rouncewell, if you will be so good." The trooper takes him in his arms like a child, lightly raises him, and turns him with his face more towards the window. "Thank you. You have your mother's gentleness," returns Sir Leicester, "and your own strength. Thank you." He signs to him with his hand not to go away. George quietly remains at the bedside, waiting to be spoken to. "Why did you wish for secrecy?" It takes Sir Leicester some time to ask this. "Truly, I am not much of a boast, Sir Leicester, and I should still, Sir Leicester, if you were not so indisposed, which I hope you will not be long, I should still hope for the favour of being allowed to remain unknown in general. That involves explanations not very hard to be guessed at, not very well timed here, and not very creditable to myself. However opinions may differ on a variety of subjects, I should think it would be universally agreed, Sir Leicester, that I am not much to boast of." "You have been a soldier," observes Sir Leicester, "and a faithful one." George makes his military bow. "As far as that goes, Sir Leicester, I have done my duty under discipline, and it was the least I could do." "You find me," says Sir Leicester, whose eyes are much attracted towards him, "far from well, George Rouncewell." "I am very sorry both to hear it and to see it, Sir Leicester." "I am sure you are. No, in addition to my older malady, I have had a sudden and bad attack, something that deadens," making the endeavour to pass one hand down one side. George, with a look of assent and sympathy, makes another bow. At different times, when they were both young men, the trooper much the younger of the two, and looked at one another down at Chesney Wold, arise before them both and soften both. Sir Leicester, evidently with a great determination to say, in his own manner, something that is on his mind before relapsing into silence, tries to raise himself among his pillows a little more. George, observant of the action, takes him in his arms again and places him as he desires to be. "Thank you, George. You are another self to me. You have often carried my spare gun at Chesney Wold, George. You are familiar to me in these strange circumstances, very familiar." He has put Sir Leicester's sounder arm over his shoulder in lifting him up, and Sir Leicester is slow in drawing it away again as he says these words. "I was about to add," he presently goes on, "I was about to add, respecting this attack, that it was unfortunately simultaneous with a slight misunderstanding between my lady and myself. I do not mean that there was any difference between us, for there has been none, but that there was a misunderstanding of certain circumstances important only to ourselves, which deprives me for a little while of my lady's society. She has found it necessary to make a journey. I trust will shortly return. Volumnia, do I make myself intelligible? The words are not quite under my command in the manner of pronouncing them." Volumnia understands him perfectly, and in truth he delivers himself with far greater plainness than could have been supported possible a minute ago. The effort by which he does so is written in the anxious and labouring expression of his face. Nothing but the strength of his purpose enables him to make it. "Therefore, Volumnia, I say in your presence, and in the presence of my old retainer and friend, Mrs. Rouncewell, whose truth and fidelity no one can question, and in the presence of her son George, who comes back like a familiar recollection of my youth in the home of my ancestors at Chesney Wold, in case I should relapse, in case I should not recover, in case I should lose both my speech and the power of writing, though I hope for better things." The old housekeeper weeping silently, Volumnia in the greatest agitation, with the freshest bloom on her cheeks, the trooper with his arms folded and his head a little bent, respectfully attentive. Therefore I desire to say, and to call you all to witness, beginning Volumnia with yourself, most solemnly, that I am on unaltered terms with Lady Dedlock, that I assert of no cause whatever of complaint against her, that I have ever had the strongest affection for her, and that I retain it undiminished. Say this to herself and to everyone. If you ever say less than this, you will be guilty of a deliberate falsehood to me. Volumnia tremblingly protests that she will observe his injunctions to the letter. My lady is in too high a position, too handsome, too accomplished, too superior in most respects to the best of those by whom she is surrounded, not to have her enemies and traducers. I dare say, let it be known to them, as I make it known to you, that being of sound mind, memory, and understanding, I revoke no disposition I have made in her favour. I abridge nothing I have ever bestowed upon her. I am on unaltered terms with her, and I recall having the full power to do it if I were so disposed as you see. No act I have done for her advantage and happiness. His formal array of words might have any other time, as it often had, something ludicrous in it, but at this time it is serious and affecting. His noble earnestness, his fidelity, his gallant shielding of her, his generous conquest of his own wrong, and his own pride for her sake, are simply honourable, manly, and true. Nothing less worthy can be seen through the lustre of such qualities in the commonest mechanic, and nothing less worthy can be seen in the best born gentleman. In such a light both aspire alike, both rise alike, both children of the dust shine equally. Overpowered by his exertions, he lays his head back on the pillows and closes his eyes for not more than a minute, when he again resumes his watching of the weather and his attention to the muffled sounds. In the rendering of those little services, and in the manner of their acceptance, the trooper has become installed as necessary to him. Nothing has been said, but it's quite understood. He falls a step or two backward, to be out of sight, and mounts guard a little behind his mother's chair. The day is now beginning to decline. The mist and the sleet into which the snow has all resolved itself are darker, and the blaze begins to tell more vividly upon the room walls and furniture. The gloom augments, the bright gas springs up in the streets, and the pertinacious oil lamps which yet hold their ground there, with their source of life half frozen and half thawed, twinkle gaspingly like fiery fish out of water, as they are. The world, which has been rumbling over straw and pulling at the bell to inquire, begins to go home, begins to dress, to dine, to discuss its dear friend with all the last new modes, as already mentioned. Now does Celeste become worse, restless, uneasy, and in great pain. Volumnia, lighting a candle with a predestined aptitude for doing something objectionable, is bidden to put it out again, for it is not yet dark enough. Yet it is very dark too, dark as it will be all night. And by she tries again. No, put it out, it is not dark enough yet. His old housekeeper is the first to understand that he is striving to uphold the fiction within himself that it is not growing late. Dear Celeste, my honoured master, she softly whispers, I must, for your own good and my duty, take the freedom of begging and praying that you will not lie here in the lone darkness, watching and waiting, dragging through time. Let me draw the curtains and light the candles, and make things more comfortable about you. The church clocks will strike the hours just the same, Celeste, and the night will pass away just the same. My lady will come back just the same. I know it, Mrs. Rouncewell, but I am weak, and he has been gone so long. Not so very long, Celeste, not 24 hours yet. Oh, but that is a long time. Oh, it is a long time. He says it with a groan that wrings her heart. She knows that this is not a period for bringing the rough light upon him. She thinks his tears are too sacred to be seen, even by her. Therefore she sits in the darkness for a while without a word, then gently begins to move about, now stirring the fire, now standing at the dark window looking out. Finally he tells her, with recovered self-command, As you say, Mrs. Ranswell, it is no worse for being confessed. It's getting late, and they are not come. Light the room. When it is lighted and the weather shut out, it is only left to him to listen. But they find that however dejected and ill he is, he brightens when a quiet pretence is made of looking at the fires in her rooms, and being sure that everything is ready to receive her. Poor pretence it is, these allusions to her being expected to keep up hope within him. Midnight comes, and with it the same blank. Carriages in the streets are few, and other late sounds in the neighbourhood there are none, unless a man so very nomadically drunk as to stray into the frigid zone goes brawling and bellowing along the pavement. Upon this wintry night it is so still that listening to the intense silence is like looking at intense darkness. If any distant sound be audible in this case, it departs through the gloom like a feeble light in that, and all is heavier than before. The corporation of servants are dismissed to bed, not unwilling to go, for they were up all last night, and only Mrs. Rouncewell and George keep watch in Sir Leicester's room. As the night lags tardily on, or rather when it seems to stop altogether, between 2 and 3 o'clock, they find a restless craving on him to know more about the weather. Now he cannot see it. Hence George, patrolling regularly every half hour to the rooms so carefully looked after, extends his march to the hall door, looks about him, and brings back the best report he can make of the worst of nights. The sleet is still falling, and even the stone footways lying ankle deep in icy sludge. Volumnia in her room up a retired landing on the staircase, the second turning past the end of the carving and gliding. A cousinly room containing a fearful abortion of a portrait of Sir Leicester's banished for its crimes, and commanding in the day a solemn yard planted with dried up shrubs like antediluvian specimens of black tea. It is a prey to horrors of many kinds. Not last nor least among them, possibly, is a horror of what may befall her little income to the event, as she expresses it, of anything happening to Sir Leicester. Anything in this sense meaning one thing only, that the last thing that can happen to the consciousness of any baronet in the known world. An effect of these horrors is that Volumnia finds she cannot go to bed in her own room or sit by the fire in her own room, but must come forth with her fair head tied up in a profusion of shawl, and her fair form enrobed in drapery, and parade the mansion like a ghost, particularly haunting the rooms warm and luxurious, prepared for one who still does not return. Solitude under such circumstances not to be thought of, Volumnia is attended by a maid, impressed from her own bed for that purpose, extremely cold, very sleepy, and generally an injured maid, is condemned by circumstance to take office with a cousin, when she had resolved to be a maid to nothing less than 10,000 a year, has not a sweet expression of countenance. The periodical visits of the trooper to these rooms, however, in the course of his patrolling, is an assurance of protection and company to both mistress and maid, which renders them very acceptable in the small hours of the night. Whenever he is heard advancing, they both make some little decorative preparation to receive him. At other times they divide their watches into short scraps of oblivion, and dialogues not wholly free from acerbity. As to whether Miss Dedlock, sitting with her feet upon the fender, was or was not falling into the fire when rescued, to her great displeasure, by her guardian genius the maid. "How is Sir Leicester now, Mr. George?" inquires Volumnia, adjusting her cowl over her head. "Why, Sir Leicester is much the same, miss. He is very low and ill, and he even wanders a little sometimes." "Has he asked for me?" inquires Volumnia tenderly. "Why, no, I can't say he has, miss. Not within my hearing, there is to say." "This is truly a sad time, Mr. George." "It is indeed, miss. Hadn't you better go to bed?" "You had a deal better go to bed, Miss Dedlock," quoth the maid sharply. Volumnia answers, "No, no, she may be asked for, she may be wanted at a moment's notice. She should never forgive herself if anything was to happen and she was not on the spot. She declines to enter on the question, mooted by the maid, and how the spot comes to be there, and not in her room, which is nearer to Sir Leicester's, but staunchly declares that on the spot she will remain. Volumnia further makes a merit of not having closed an eye, as if she had 20 or 30, though it is hard to reconcile this statement with having the most indisputably opened two within 5 minutes. But when it comes to 4 o'clock, and still the same blank, Volumnia's constancy begins to fail her, or rather it begins to strengthen, for she now considers that it is her duty to be ready for the morrow, when much may be expected of her, that in fact, howsoever anxious to remain upon the spot, it may be required of her, as an act of self-devotion, to desert the spot. So when the trooper reappears with his "Hadn't you better go to bed, miss?" and when the maid protests more sharply than before, "You had a better deal go to bed, Miss Dedlock," she meekly rises and says, "Do with me what you think best." Mr. George undoubtedly thinks it best to escort her on his arm to the door of her cousinly chamber, and the maid as undoubtedly thinks it best to hustle her into bed with mighty little ceremony. Accordingly these steps are taken, and now the trooper in his rounds has the house to himself. There is no improvement in the weather. From the portico, the eaves, from the parapet, from every ledge and post and pillar, drips the thawed snow. It has crept, as if for shelter, into the lintels of the great door, under it, into the corners of the windows, into every chink and crevice of retreat, and there wastes and dies. It is falling still upon the roof, upon the skylight, even through the skylight, and drip, 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 with the regularity of the ghost's walk on the stone floor below. The trooper, his old recollections awakened by the solitary grandeur of Great House, no novelty to him once at Chesney Wold, goes up the stairs and through the chief rooms, holding up his light at arm's length, thinking of his varied fortunes within the last few weeks, and of his rustic boyhood, and of the two periods of his life so strangely brought together across the wide intermediate space, thinking of the murdered man whose image is fresh in his mind, thinking of the lady who has disappeared from these very rooms, and the tokens of whose recent presence are all here, thinking of the master of the house upstairs, and of the foreboding, who will tell him? He looks here, he looks there, and reflects how he might see something now, which it would tax his boldness to walk up and lay his hand upon, and prove to be a fancy. But it is all blank, blank as the darkness above and below, while he goes up the great staircase, blank as the oppressive silence. Is all still in readiness, George Rouncewell? Quite orderly and right, Sir Leicester. No word of any kind? The trooper shakes his head. No letter that can possibly have been overlooked? But he knows there is no such hope as that, and lays his head down without looking for an answer. Very familiar to him, as he said himself some hours ago, George Rouncewell lifts him into an easier position through the long remainder of the blank wintry night, and equally familiar with his unexpressed wish, extinguishes the light which undraws the curtains at the first break of day. The day comes like a phantom, cold, colourless, and vague. It sends a warning streak before it of a death-like hue, as if it cried out, "Look what I am bringing to you who watch there. Who will tell him?"